A line drawn on a map in 1954 split a nation in two, setting the stage for one of the most divisive conflicts of the 20th century. The Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, creating a communist North under Ho Chi Minh and a pro-Western South. An election to reunify the country was planned for 1956, but it never happened. Fearing a communist victory, South Vietnam's leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, backed by the United States, refused to participate. This decision solidified the partition and sowed the seeds of a civil war that would soon spiral into an international crisis. The United States, operating under the domino theory, the belief that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would follow, began sending military advisors to support South Vietnam. What started as a few hundred advisors in the late 1950s grew to over 16,000 by 1963. Their mission was to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, to fight the growing communist insurgency in the South, known as the Viet Cong. These advisors were not officially combat troops, but they were often on the front lines, and the line between advising and fighting quickly blurred. President John F. Kennedy deepened this commitment, believing that South Vietnam was a critical battleground in the Cold War. But as the Viet Cong grew stronger and Diem's government became more unstable, it became clear that a limited advisory role was not enough to prevent a collapse. America was being pulled deeper and deeper into the conflict. The turning point came in August 1964, in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The official story was that North Vietnamese patrol boats launched unprovoked attacks on the USS Maddox, a U.S. destroyer. In response, Congress overwhelmingly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. This resolution was the legal foundation for America's massive escalation. In March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops, 3,500 Marines, landed at Da Nang. The advisory mission was over. America was now at war. With boots on the ground, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The goal was to cripple the North's ability to support the Viet Cong and force them to the negotiating table. From 1965 to 1968, American planes dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than were dropped in all of World War II. On the ground, U.S. strategy focused on search and destroy missions, aiming to kill enemy fighters faster than they could be replaced. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces, believed in a war of attrition. By 1967, nearly 500,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam, fighting a brutal guerrilla war in dense jungles and rice paddies. The enemy was elusive, the terrain was unforgiving, and victory seemed just as distant as ever. January 1968, as Vietnam celebrated the Lunar New Year, or Tet, the war took a shocking and decisive turn. In a massive coordinated assault, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched surprise attacks on cities and military bases all across South Vietnam. They even breached the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the Communists. They suffered catastrophic losses and failed to hold any of their objectives. But politically, it was a stunning victory. Back in America, the public had been told the enemy was on the ropes and that there was light at the end of the tunnel. The images of Tet told a different story. The offensive shattered the illusion of an impending U.S. victory and proved that no part of South Vietnam was secure. Public support for the war plummeted, and a credibility gap opened between the government's optimistic reports and the grim reality on the ground. As the war dragged on, a powerful anti-war movement erupted across the United States. It started on college campuses, but quickly grew to include people from all walks of life. Protesters marched on Washington, burned draft cards, and held teach-ins to educate the public. The movement was fueled by a number of factors: the rising number of American casualties, the graphic images of violence on the evening news, and the growing sense that the war was immoral and unwinnable. Events like the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where police clashed violently with protesters, and the 1970 Kent State shootings, where National Guardsmen killed for students during a protest, exposed the deep divisions the war had created within American society. The anti-war movement didn't end the war on its own, but it put immense pressure on political leaders to find a way out. Elected in 1968 on a promise to achieve peace with honor, President Richard Nixon introduced a new policy: Vietnamization. The plan was to gradually withdraw U.S. troops while building up the South. Vietnamese military so they could fight the war on their own. As American soldiers began to come home, Nixon expanded the air war, secretly bombing communist supply lines in neighboring Cambodia and Laos. This expansion of the conflict was highly controversial and sparked further outrage at home. Vietnamization was a strategy to reduce American casualties and political fallout, but it was also a gamble. It rested on the hope that a strengthened South Vietnamese army could hold off the North without the support of American ground troops. It was an exit strategy, but one that left the fate of South Vietnam hanging in the balance. After years of grueling negotiations, a breakthrough finally came. In January 1973, the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement called for a complete ceasefire, the withdrawal of all U.S. troops, and the release of all prisoners of war. For America, the war was officially over. The last U.S. combat soldiers left Vietnam 2 months later. But for the Vietnamese, the fighting never truly stopped. The accords were a peace with honor for the Americans, allowing them to exit the conflict. But it left the political future of Vietnam unresolved, essentially leaving the North and South to fight it out. The ceasefire was fragile from the start, and it wouldn't take long for the final chapter of the war to unfold. With American troops gone and US aid dwindling, South Vietnam stood alone. In early 1975, North Vietnam launched its final, massive offensive. The South Vietnamese army, plagued by corruption and low morale, collapsed with stunning speed. City after city fell. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The city was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and the war was over. The world watched the dramatic images of the chaotic evacuation from the U.S. Embassy, as helicopters airlifted the last Americans and desperate Vietnamese allies from rooftops. The Fall of Saigon marked the definitive end of the Vietnam War and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. America's long and painful struggle had ended in defeat. The legacy of the Vietnam War is profound and far-reaching. For Vietnam, decades of war left the country devastated, with millions of military and civilian casualties. The landscape was scarred by bombs and chemical defoliants like Agent Orange, which continues to cause health problems to this day. For the United States, the war cost over 58,000 American lives and created deep societal divisions that took decades to heal. It changed the way Americans viewed their government, their military, and their role in the world. The Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance to commit U.S. forces to foreign conflicts, influenced American foreign policy for years. The veterans who returned home were often met not with parades, but with protests and public indifference, suffering from physical and psychological wounds that many carry to this day. The war remains a powerful and painful reminder of the complexities of conflict and its enduring human cost. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more content.